Hi. So I am Lizzie Bildner. I'm a second-year CBS student. I am co-chair of the Conference for CEO, and I am very pleased and honored to introduce our final keynote, Joanne Wilson. As many of you know, she doesn't need much of an introduction. If you follow her on Twitter or at her blog, Gotham Gal, she's a well-respected angel investor. She has over 65 companies in her portfolio and has done a number of careers before that. I don't want to take too much time because really all the genius is right there. So without further ado.
Okay, thank you. So when I was speaking today, I of course asked, what do you want me to talk about? Because I don't have your kind of standard speech because I'm not a big believer in that. And they said 3 things they wanted to hear about. 1, my story, which I thought was kind of interesting. I'm not positive they would have asked a man to kind of give the story of where they are today, but I was happy to give it because I think history is important. And the second is my take on the whole New York tech scene in regards to funding and where we are. And then the third, I'm going to talk a little bit about women, which is something I'm a big supporter of. So I'll give you a short synopsis of my story. I decided out of high school that I decided to go to Simmons College, which is an all-women's college in Boston. It was definitely a choice that I made that because I was pretty much not paying any attention in high school and realized that when I graduated, it was really important that I had a job because no one else was going to pay for my future. And what's kind of interesting about that is I wasn't into the women thing. I could really care less. I just knew that by going there, when I graduated, I would absolutely have a job. And so it's kind of interesting in regards to full circle, which is now I'm very big involved in women's issues. So I went to Simmons. I graduated. I went to work in the retail world at Macy's, where it was a very different world back then. One of the greatest things about Macy's was that your first job, you got placed, and then every single job after that, for the next 3 years, you had to interview to get picked up. And what's interesting about that, and I'm sure I don't know if any of you read recently that Ellen Powell decided at Reddit that men and women end up with different salaries because women don't do such a good job as negotiating for their salaries. And so she was just going to make the salaries all equal when you walk in. And the reality is, and I actually went back and forth with her on email, is that if you do that, you never learn how to negotiate. And so when you're out there negotiating for your own company, if you don't learn how to negotiate from the very beginning, you're sort of not teaching anyone any lessons. So this is a great experience. And I moved very quickly up the ladder. I was made a buyer within 3 years. And then the good thing about it is I had 3 jobs super quick. The bad thing about it is then you're ready for the next job. And there was a gentleman there who basically told me that women do not move as quickly as men. And at that point, the company had gone private. And I knew just enough to be dangerous because my husband had just graduated graduate school and became a venture capitalist. And I was like, well, am I getting stock for this? And they're like, no. And I was like, okay, I'm out, and I left. And the one thing that's interesting is that quitting that first job is so scary. But once you quit it the first time, what's amazing is you can have several jobs and quit every single one because there's no fear involved. And so I pretty much went on to do that. I left that world, and I went to the other side, and I went into the wholesale world. The first year, I worked in a company. I doubled my salary. And I worked in sales, something I thought I should learn because the reality is I think sales is the root of all success. After a year, quit, had enough of that one, went to another business, and I really learned is the back end of the business. So I learned how to make a garment. And I thought that was really important because as I moved forward, I actually wanted to understand what the nuts and bolts are, what the margins were of the business. And so I did that for a year. I worked for a miserable human being, this woman. And after a year, I'd had enough, and I quit that too. Then the third year, I went to work for this guy who had a tiny little business, really in the schmata business. He maybe did $1 million a year. That's what he told me. But in hindsight, I don't think he was doing that. And I, came in, rolled my sleeves up, said that he needed to be getting in all these other different businesses, and within roughly 8 months, I grew his business to be a $12 million business. It was a very different time. You could really dial for dollars. It wasn't so structured in the retail business. And then I got to a point where I was making more money than him, and he decided that I should take less money than him, and so I left there too. The good news is that we had moved to the suburbs at that point. We had 2 kids in tow that were, I think at that point, barely 3 and 1. I had a couple things after that, and I went to work for this one company, and the guy fired me and said to me, "You think you should be just doing this because you have children? Not only should you be my boss, you should be my boss's boss, and you should be running this company." And I called my husband. I said, "They just fired me." He said, "I want you to leave this business and never return." So I went home, moved to the suburbs, had 2 kids, got off the train for a while. It was an amazing experience, had a 3rd child. And then one day I was at a play date and listening to all these mothers speak, and all of a sudden I could hear nothing. And I thought, oh my God, if I had a gun in my back, I'd kill all of them and then kill myself. So I went home that day and I told my husband, I gotta go back to work. And what was nice at that time is that it was the beginning of the internet business, and it was in the mid-90s. And he came home the next day, not even a week later, the next day, and he said, "Listen, there's this guy, you've met him before, Jason Calacanis. He's basically going around the industry with these, couple of pages stapled together, and he thinks he's going to write about this next industry, which is the internet," which is essentially what he was investing in my husband as well. So you should go talk to Jason. You know how to build businesses. So I went and talked to Jason, and this time I said, "I'm not going to work for you. Pure freelance." I was his first hire. I get 20% everything I bring in, end of story. He's like, "Great." So fast forward, another mails business that I built. We went from being 10 stapled pages into a glossy bound magazine. We had events through an organization arm that we called the Rising Tide Summit, and we also had an online Z. And it was a crazy time. I remember coming in one day from the suburbs to meet Jason, and it was the day that AOL launched their chat. And I was sitting at a computer, and of course, a big-ass screen, and we were texting each other through chat, like, "I'll meet you down the street, I'll do this," and it was like, can you believe we can do this? And so, of course, we've come a lot farther from then. What was interesting about that time period is that there was a lot of smoke and mirrors. There's a lot of people that were like, there's something here with this internet, and we should build businesses on it. But most of those people didn't grow up with the internet. They did not grow up with computers on their lap. They did not grow up with handheld phones. They just saw an opportunity. And because of that, and because it cost a lot to build those businesses, there was a lot of smoke and mirrors and a lot of valuations that were absolutely and utterly ridiculous. So there was a point where I actually had 2 people that were willing to buy Jason's business for $40 million. And Jason, who is, I think, 10 plus years younger than me, said, "Oh no, I'm not selling. I'm going to be the next Rupert Murdoch." I was like, I think you should take the money because the window is closing a little bit every day. Take the money, invest for a couple years, you can do anything you want. No. Okay, fine. Next day, I quit. And I went on to actually chair an organization called Mouse. Mouse's organization is called Making Opportunities for Upgrading Schools and Education. And we started out literally crawling through schools and wiring them. And fast forward, the Mouse is still around, and we are in, I think, 35 countries in 18 states. And essentially what they do is they hire the kids in the school to be the IT people. It's a great organization, and what's interesting is that both my husband and I care very much about STEM and CS, and we really got behind Mouse because we felt like we need to have access to to kids that don't have access. It was a very underserved community that weren't getting access to computers. And fast forward, we were started in Washington Irving High School, and he just started another nonprofit, which is called the Academy of Software Engineering, which is teaching computer science curriculum in the New York City public high schools, and he started it in the exact same place, which is Washington Irving High School. So Then what happened was the industry imploded. The mortgage and the banking banking went under, and the entire industry in Silicon Valley and Silicon Alley and all the tech industry all went to smoke and mirrors. I actually saw someone this week who I hadn't seen since then, and he told me that the day before all of this happened, he was in someone's office who was going to pay them $100 million for their business. They were going to merge these businesses together. He was thinking of all these things he was going to do with the money. He had already moved past, and the following day, of course, that was the end of his business, and the plug was pulled. And so it's just something to think about as you actually go forward as entrepreneurs with your businesses and thinking about what their valuation is actually worth. So I stopped doing mouse, I went home again, and I started thinking about what do I want to do next. And along came the next generation of the web, and it took a couple years, and I started blogging. And so I started blogging about 11 years ago when blogging was like the next thing that people were talking about. And it was very slow what started to happen. I mean, I think we all knew who each other were who was blogging. And what was interesting is I really did it because I was home, was raising my family, and I didn't want to lose that connection with the technology industry. And I thought, this is my way to continue to keep my cred and continue to connect with that industry. But what was interesting is that a lot of the industry left, and they never came back. It was the next generation that I was starting to connect with. And through that, I sort of became this chick magnet, because what I was writing about. And I would hear from all these women, and they would talk to me about their businesses. And then I was watching some of these businesses grow. One of the businesses I was watching was Curb Media. Curb Media includes Curbed, Racked, and Eater. And I was like, wow, this is how we're going to take on content. This is the next generation of magazines, content, and what have you not. And I said to my husband, I'm obsessed with this company. And I said, it's too bad that this is not your thesis. You would never invest in this thing. And he's like, no, but you should. I was like, really? He's like, yeah, this could be your next career. I think you'd be really good at it. I was like, all right. So I called Bach, put money into Curb, and that was my first investment. One investment turns into actually 80 at this point. Lemonade stand on Monday, chain by Friday. And what was great is that, this time it was mine and I owned it. And so those entrepreneurial efforts actually ended up being my entrepreneurial efforts. So 5 years into investing, the one thing that I did do as I started investing after Curbed is I made a conscious decision to invest in women. 10 years ago was the first time that I really started to see many more women start businesses. And it wasn't so much there wasn't women in the first generation of the web, but not like there is now. And so I made this conscious decision. So 75% of the investments that I've made are women entrepreneurs. Their companies are run by and led by women. And then 5 years after that, I started something called the Women's Entrepreneur Festival. The funny thing is when you have a Women's Entrepreneur Festival, men do not apply to come. And what we realized at the event is that there was this incredible energy that would happen in the room because all of these women were there, and the walls went down, and these women could have these conversations that they couldn't have when men were in the room. And it had anything to do with, how do you get food in the refrigerator? Where did you get those shoes? How did you build your business? And there was never, there's no, should I not be asking that question? Because women tend to cross their T's, dot their I's, underpromise, overdeliver. And so this festival has really created this community for women that they can rely and lean on each other because there is a group that continues year after year and on these listservs. And I think 30% of the people that attend this festival return year after year after year, which is pretty cool. And the one thing about all of this over the last 10 years, which I think is essential for an entrepreneur, is that it isn't something that I felt like I should do. I mean, I kind of felt like I should do Mouse because I thought it was important for our children to see one of us give back to this community. I was sort of in between, and that was a great way to see, if you are lucky enough to have the success, the financial success that we have, it is essential that you give back to the community. You have a responsibility. But when it came to this, it wasn't so much I should do it. It was something that I felt I must do. I must get up every day and do something like this. I love it. I enjoy it. I think I'm the luckiest person in the world to talk to entrepreneurs and work with them all day. And right here in New York, to me, which is the epicenter of the universe, is like no other better place to invest in companies. I think what's really interesting about New York is that we have the best medical, we have the best finance, we have the best fashion, we have the best media. And so what has happened is that everyone in the technology industry is building businesses that change every single one of those industries. So they have one foot in media and one foot in technology. They have one foot in fashion and one foot in technology. So it creates a very interesting industry in the technology industry because it's really a variety of different verticals that all come together. What I'm actually seeing that a lot now is in Los Angeles. You know, Los Angeles, that was purely Hollywood. A lot of the startups that are happening there now have nothing to do with entertainment. And it's a really good thing to see. And you see it in different areas around the country. You're seeing it in Austin, Texas. You're seeing it in places in Ohio. And so, you know, it's a very interesting landscape. And I don't think that Silicon Valley ever thought that that was going to happen in New York. And when they opened up Google offices here, Google didn't even think that people would want to, work out of their offices in New York. And it ends up they have to buy a whole building to house all those people. And now you have Twitter here. And I think the other thing that's happened to New York, which is really important, if you really think about who's been the most successful entrepreneur in New York, it's Michael Bloomberg. I mean, here's an entrepreneur who grew this incredible business and stayed in New York. So any of the businesses that had quasi-success in New York, many of them left, went to other companies, and really did not make their mark here. So to see something like Etsy happen this week, which is a tremendous thing for not only the technology community, but it's a great thing for New York. And to see Tumblr sell to Yahoo is a great thing for New York because it says to other entrepreneurs, there's an opportunity here to grow a business and to have a fantastic exit. And there are people here that you can hire for your teams and your companies. So one of the things I also want to talk about is how do you fund your companies? And what's really happened over the past decade is there has been a lot more money at the lower levels. A lot of people have had tremendous success, are thinking to themselves, I want to give back. Like, I want to take a piece of my money and I want to invest in startups because I can risk that capital. And I have had enough provenance in my career that I feel I can bring something to the party when I invest in these companies. So we're seeing a lot more angel investors. I don't think 20 years ago anyone knew what the name what an angel investor was. The other thing that we have are micro VCs. So VCs that have funds that are around $30 million, that can put a lot of money in at the beginning, at the very onset, follow forward. But it's not so important to them to have the billion-dollar exit. Some of them will have billion-dollar exits, but it's a different kind of strategy and thesis and investment. The other thing that we're seeing is a lot of the corporate funds have arms, Comcast, Hearst, and they have a completely different thesis as well, what they're looking to invest in. They, a lot of times, do not invest in pure technology companies. They have a very different way, the way they want to look at it, how long they'll take in terms of the life of the company, if it actually works with the companies that they have under their umbrella. Even private equity funds that are $150 billion companies are now have small tech arms of $150 million, which is nothing to a $150 billion business, but it is interesting that they're getting into this industry too. And then, of course, you have crowdfunding. And one of the things I love about crowdfunding is if you are someone in Idaho that has, done quite well financially, wants to put some money to risk, ends up, you were in a CPG product your entire career. You actually know how to build a product that should be on every single shelf in America and every supermarket. And you go online and you see this amazing product and you're like, oh my God, I could help that entrepreneur. You can put money in there and you can have a connection with that entrepreneur and you can make a difference in those companies. Because certainly you're not getting deal flow in Idaho. So I think that that's a really great thing about crowdfunding. And the one thing that's interesting is I've seen women come more into the stage in the last decade is that this mixed bag of funding has made it easier for women to enter the stratosphere in regards to their companies. First of all, when you build a company, you should think about, am I VC fundable? Am I a billion-dollar company? And if the answer is you're not, don't waste your time with VCs. So you should really think about, what am I worth? And what I love about this is and I bring this up, is that I think for women, one of the things that have been interesting in this past decade is the technology has helped them not only start their own companies, but at the same time raise their own families and have the balance between family, friends, and business. Because there are technologies out there now that can make their lives easier. You can order your food online. There's new companies popping up like Hop, Skip, Drive, where it's Uber for your young children, which has started in the West Coast and I'm sure is going to slowly move out here. There are all these different ways that make it easier for women to build businesses. And I think women in technology make a lot of sense. And if you go back in the beginning of time, women were actually the first programmers. And if you go back, and I gave a speech a couple months ago, and I went through the history of women entrepreneurs, many of them women were not allowed to get patents decades ago. And so their businesses that they started were under their husband's name. And so we don't even know the amount of women that started businesses. And remember, 50 or 60 years ago, women were told they could either be nurses, teachers, or wives. And that's pretty much it. And that was the direction they were given. And so, I will say that we've come a lot farther than that. And also women's voting is only 100 years old. So, we have changed, and it's important, I believe, as we grow our companies, that we think about the importance of gender balance in our companies. I mean, I know when I get a deck and I open it up and there's like 5 smiling bros, I'm like, no interest. Because I want to know that they decided at the very onset, we need some women in here. And if you look at data, you'll see that gender-balanced companies tend to do better, have better success, better ROIs. And so it's an important thing that we all come from a different place and bring something different to the table. So the one thing that's actually interesting about women is that women actually receive 50% less capital than their male counterparts. Because if you remember, or you don't remember, I know, is that 4% of VCs are women. And so for women to go pitch to someone on the other side of the table who's a guy who doesn't understand their business, it's very difficult to raise capital. But that is changing, obviously, through angel investing, as well as crowdfunding, as well as micro VCs, and certainly men that understand that women generally end up, if you look at the data, have better success than men when they start companies. They value contribution, they're great team players, they're happy to admit they've made mistakes. And what's interesting also is that in regards to internet users, 60% of women use the internet versus 40% men in terms of on the internet, reading things, content, whatever it is. But what's more interesting is that 60% of all purchases are made by women, and 85% of all purchases are influenced by women. So when I look at an e-commerce company that has nothing to do with women, I really have to say, really? So I do believe that it is very important to have gender balance when we start. I think that as a group, as you graduate and you move forward, that you need to push for cultural change. Change has to come from outside. It never, ever, ever comes from within. And that's what's wonderful about all these companies. And as you see them grow, and we see some of these companies become more and more mature, generally in any single vertical, there's going to be one winner at the very end of the day. And the importance of having gender balance, I think you have a better chance of getting in there. So if we build more companies that are started and led by women, I think we will see more companies follow suit. And it's important that we create that rising tide, because I think it is for a new type of feminism, and feminism is not just for women, it's for men too. And I do think the time is now. I think we are at a tipping point, and it's a very big moment where women are on the threshold, where women's businesses are becoming unstoppable, and it will change, not only the way they live their lives, but the way that we live our lives. And that is the culture that I'm talking about. So as more women get funded, more women go public, more women exit for a huge amount of money, more women's products are become household names, I think we're going to see the shift in companies having gender 50-50. And I do think that is so important as we move forward. We are living in this time that I refer to as Startup Nation. And I talked about it at the beginning, where regards that we are the epicenter of the universe here with all these different industries. And technology is changing everything. I look back, and I think that we will all look back and think about how incredibly lucky we all are to live through this time period and build businesses. There are shifts in the economy right now. There are shifts in entrepreneurism. There's shifts in new products. People are building new mattresses. People are building better products that are gluten-free bars instead of like bars that are loaded with sugar. Things are changing in the way that we eat. Things are changing in transportation. I was talking to someone this morning whose family owns a bunch of garages around the city. And I was like, well, are you starting to think about what it's going to look like in 10 years? Because more people don't need cars. You've got Uber, you have Lyft, you have Sidecar. A lot of people aren't getting licenses. And I know, there will be a time not too far in the future where cars are going to be driving you. You will not be driving the car. And so there'll be less and less cars in Manhattan. And so what are you going to be doing with all your garages? And they are starting to think about that. Everything is changing, even textiles. So I think what is most exciting right now is that the opportunities out there are huge. And you should all be thinking about how you want to participate in this new economy. I think what's the most important thing is that you get up every day and you're excited about what you're doing. Because more of you young people are going to live to be 100 years old. You will have an opportunity to have several careers. You could stay home for 10 years with your kid and you can come back on. You could, decide that I'm going to work in a startup for the first 20 years and I'm going to make an IPO, and my next career is going to be making chocolate. The most important thing is to get up every day and love what you do. Life, even though you might live to be 100 years old, is too short not to do that. Thank you.